Good morning to our audience in the US and good afternoon to our audience overseas. First of all, I would like to thank you, our amazing partner, Atlantic Council in Turkey, especially Defne Arslan and her team for co-organizing a timely manner webinar during COVID-19. Also, special thanks to Professor Gülnur Aybet, Damon Wilson, and Matt Kronig. Turkish Heritage Organization is celebrating 5th year of establishment. We are a young, independent, non-partisan organization funded by Turkish and Turkish American businesses. To foster a deep and comprehensive dialogue at a time when the US and Turkey relations are its lowest, THO has been diligently organizing public events, programs, and publishing timely and independent facts that provide a unique platform for exploring critical issues. Turkey and United States have stood side by side in difficult times. Cooperation between two NATO allies during COVID-19 pandemic is a proof that solidarity continues. Turkey sent two Turkish military cargo planes loaded with medical supplies and protective equipment to the United States. This was a true example of allied solidarity. We believe, and history proves, that if two NATO allies can proceed on a positive agenda, it will be beneficial for us and international community. The world after COVID-19 is heading somewhere completely different. It seems inevitable that we will see radical changes in several areas, such as territorial nation states, globalization, the global economic order, diplomatic and military relations, and national interests and social life. The difference between poor and rich countries, the criteria for being considered developed and underdeveloped, and even domestic policies and political systems will change this pandemic. In my opinion, COVID-19 will have a massive impact on globalization, and from now on, countries will follow a more sovereign policy where they meet their own needs through domestic production. The coronavirus has started to make a profound impact on individuals, communities, and countries. What matters the most is that leaders who reach information first, manage it transparently, and invest in people instead of maintaining a narrow policy will be the winners. I'm pleased to pass the floor to Daphne to have her opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, very much. It's a pleasure really for us to cooperate with Turkish Heritage Organization. And thank you and your team for this opportunity. Distinguished guests, on behalf of Atlantic Council and as director of its program on Turkey, I would like to welcome you all. Since the inception of our Atlantic Council in Turkey program in 2018 and our engagement with Turkey, which is over 10 years now, we continue to play an impactful role on important subjects, including bilateral relations. I am delighted to be connected with everyone virtual today on the crisis of the liberal order and future of global cooperation. We are honored to be joined today by Senior Turkish Presidential Advisor, Professor Aybet. It is great to have you today, Professor Gülnur Aybet. Thank you for joining. It is also a great pleasure to be hosting Atlantic Council Executive Vice President Damon Wilson today, and our moderator, Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Deputy Director and Director of the Global Strategy Initiative, Matthew Kronig. We are in the midst of an era of unprecedented change and uncertainty. Our multilateral institutions, created in the wake of the world's most destructive conflict, have proven ineffective in dealing with the threat of COVID-19. Globalization is increasingly in question, and nation-states are more and more seeking to guard their interests through bilateral rather than multilateral partnerships. Nevertheless, there are many issues facing the world which require global coordination and response. Intractable conflicts, climate change, migration, emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, and more require global dialogue to move forward. The COVID-19 has devastated the lives and livelihoods of millions across the world. One important lesson we need to take and act upon is that We are all connected and we face common threats that deserve a common response like all global threats. This event will be a great opportunity to hear from three of the preeminent thinkers on international system. I'm greatly looking forward to hearing their views on the liberal world order and its future. If and how should be reformed for our new era and what alternative would be. Without further ado, I'm pleased to pass the floor to Matthew Croning to start the panel. Thanks, Matthew. Floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Daphna. Thank you all for joining us today. It's really my honor to moderate this event. I'm, of course, as was mentioned, the Deputy Director of the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council, but I'm also on the Board of Advisors of the Turkish Heritage Organization, so I have a dual obligation here to participate and really happy to do so. So we're discussing an important issue today, the liberal international order. The United States, Turkey, and its other allies really created the world that we live in today, beginning after World War II with the establishment of NATO, the United Nations, eventually World Trade Organization. And this system has worked well for many, but it's currently under threat. So what do we do about this rules-based system? In addition, today we'll discuss the U.S.-Turkey alliance. I think both the organizations here today are in favor of a strong U.S.-Turkey relationship, but these are challenging times, and so we'll discuss the U.S.-Turkey relationship in the context of the broader liberal order, and we have two great experts to do this today, so a view from Washington and a point of view from Ankara. Just to go over the agenda, we have an hour. I'll spend the first 30 or 40 minutes or so in a moderated discussion with our experts, but then there will be time at the end for Q&A. So I would ask all of the audience to be thinking of your questions, and you'll see that there is a Q&A function in Zoom. And so if you have questions, feel free to add your questions in that box. As soon as you have them, I can try to address them in the moderated discussion, and if not, we can get to them in Q&A. Should say that it might not be possible to get to all the questions given our limited time today, but we look forward to engaging with as many of you as possible. So for the moderated discussion portion, I really thought it would make sense to continue in three parts. First, discuss what is this liberal international world order. Second, discuss where it is today and some of the challenges to it. And then third, discuss where do we go from here and what should we do about it? What should the United States and Turkey do about revitalizing the system? So to begin, Professor Aybet, maybe I'll start with you and with the question of what is the liberal world order? And I say this because this term is widely used. But some critics have said, well, it's so vague, it's like a fog. What precisely is and is not the liberal order? So let's begin with you. What is the liberal international order? What's meant by it? What are the key features? And how did the U.S. relationship play a role in shaping this order? So Professor Aybet, over to you.
Hello. Thank you very much for the introduction, Matthew. When we're going to start with a definition of the liberal world order, I think we need to look at two things. First of all, the difference between the idea of what a liberal world order is and what it has been in practice. And I think to differentiate between the two is very important, considering the juncture where we are today, where the liberal world order is under unprecedented challenges than it's seen today. And the second thing I think we need to look at is which liberal order we're talking about, because I think there's three different types in three different eras. And if we break it down into three different eras, I think the first one was the vision of a liberal post-World War II order and its implementation by visionaries such as George Kennan and Paul Nietzsche, and in Europe, Jean Monnet. So this was a time when I think there was a lot of vision about creating an order that had certain norms at its bedrock, but also was safeguarded with very robust institutions, and an order that would create a fail-safe for the return to a war system in Europe, which had already seen this develop into two major world wars. So in that sense, there was a very practical side of it, implementing. And it's always easier, I suppose, well, of course, you shouldn't say easy, because I'm sure it wasn't that easy for the people who were implementing it back in 1945. But in hindsight, it's probably easier to implement a grand design with a vision when you're almost acting on an empty slate, which is usually a post-war situation. Now, the second era was actually 1990, I think, when, with the collapse of communism, end of the Cold War, and there you had the more sort of euphoric, triumphant liberal order. And there you had the visionaries of another age, such as Eikenberry and Fukuyama. And I think now we've entered the third stage, where I think Eikenberry has put it quite nicely when he says that the decline of the liberal order in this third stage is actually, it's happening because it's unchallenged by an other. In order to legitimize itself, I think it always needed an other, in inverted commas. And I think the lack of an other was precisely what exacerbated the decline from 1990s onwards, whereas it should have actually strengthened it, because this was the era of the triumphant moment of the liberal world order. And I think that has become a challenge in it, because as Eikenberry says, as it turned into, it always existed as one half of a bipolar system, but as it emerged into a global order, that's when it started to fragment, because it was no longer a club. And I think this is one of the other fault lines of the liberal world order, that a club is by definition, it's for members, and those who are not are outside. So it's very exclusive. It's not inclusive. And I think, that's one of the crux questions that we need to address, that if it is exclusive and it's global, how does it match those two things? So I think these are some of the definitional problems that we find the liberal world order has experienced today. But I'll stop there, because I know, I shouldn't really, I've got a lot more to say about it, but I'll stop there for now.
Well, that's a fantastic way to start us off. Thank you very much. And we'll certainly have more opportunity to hear more from you on that. So Damon Wilson, let's go to you. Same question. What is the order? What about this challenge raised by Professor Ibet, that there's a tension between being exclusive and being global? And then maybe also, what have been the effects of this order? Has this been beneficial to the United States, to Turkey, and to the rest of the world? So Mr. Wilson, over to you.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much. First, Professor Kronig, Professor Ibet, I am flanked by two impressive professors with great records. So I'm a little bit outflanked in this conversation today. And I'm going to come to this from the perspective of my role at the Council and my role as a strategist in the US government previously. First, a hats off and thank you to our partners at THO, the Turkish Heritage Organization. It's a pleasure to be partnering with you on this. And it's a pleasure to see my good friend, Professor Ibet in Ankara today to talk about these important things. Matt, I'm going to take your question and start with the outcome, the results. What's the benefit? Because I think this is far too abstract of a conversation or concept at times for people to understand. My grandmother, my mother, they don't really understand liberal international order. What are you talking about? But when you objectively sit back and look at history, as you have done in your own research, as the Atlantic Council has sort of captured in some of our landmark strategy reports on this issue of thinking about an international order, I want to start with those results. If you look back historically, and look, we're in this moment, we can see history up close, we can see for all its perils and all its faults, and particularly today. But historically speaking, we saw 7 decades with a stretch of historic peace that was pretty remarkable, an absence of great power war over 7 decades, which stretches back hundreds of years. And that's something that's easy to take for granted when you were living it or when you were coming out of that period. We also, as we document in a paper that Professor Kronig had a role in writing with the Atlantic Council, this liberal international order helped produce a tripling of GDP per capita globally, 8 times for the average American, an extraordinary production of prosperity and wealth globally, in which we saw about extreme poverty engulf 66% of the globe at the end of World War II in a way that was brought to under 10%. Now, are we satisfied with the situation that this order produced? Absolutely not. We see injustices, poverty, international conflicts too much. But it's worth having this historic perspective of a system that began with 17 democracies and helped nurture an environment that produced 96 democracies. That is a system in which, prior to this, there was a 1% chance that a human on this planet was killed in war, an active battle, something that was reduced to 1/100th% today, even as bad as the headlines are when you open up a paper. So I start with that because it's too abstract to understand what we're talking about from a liberal international order. But when you take from a historic perspective and see the benefits in terms of peace, prosperity, and individual freedom, this period has been the best time to live as a human on our planet, even though we recognize how much more we have to do. And so I think that's what I would begin with to say, how to give meaning and purpose to a set of norms, a set of principles that underpin the set of institutions and practices that help govern global security, the global economy, and global governance around the set of rules that really fostered a peaceful, predictable, cooperative behavior among states. Formal institutions to legitimize and at times enforce them, or at least provide forums for their debate and dispute resolution. And was really backed up, and this is a key part, it was backed up by a role of democratic states that were prepared to preserve and help defend it. And that gets to your question. Our founders of the Atlantic Council, the Dean Achesons and others that were part of the San Francisco negotiations, part of the founding of the NATO alliance, part of the Bretton Woods negotiations that created this order, they did it twofold. In 1945, we came out of the gates trying to set up a universal set of norms and standards, the United Nations, that encompassed everyone. We also saw the challenges and limits of that. In part, it was the Turkish Straits crisis, the Greek Civil War, Soviet manipulation of the potential of the future of Turkey that led the United States to then think of, okay, yes, we have a set of universal institutions, but we better have one that brings together like-minded nations and a set of alliances. And it really grew out of the tensions in Southeast Europe and Turkey that helped produce NATO to create the parallelism of both universal institutions and exclusive ones side by side as part of this international liberal order.
Great. Thank you very much, Damon. So a pretty strong defense of the benefits of this order in terms of peace, prosperity, and freedom. Professor Ibit, back to you. What do you see as the benefits of this liberal international order? What do you see as its shortcomings? And has this order been implemented justly and fairly, or is that even possible? Please, back over to you.
Thank you. I would agree with Damon. When we look at when we look back and we look at the origins, it's been quite remarkable. And like Damon said, if you look at it from the perspective of the human being, ours must be a generation probably that's not witnessed war, suffering, or anything like that, like previous generations had. So when you talk to people who have lived through the Second World War, First World War, it's a totally different human experience. So in that sense, when you consider Europe as a core that has been a centuries-old war system that led to 2 major destructive global wars in the 20th century, to transform that war system into a peace system, I think in that sense, the EU has been a remarkable project in that sense. And in the post-Cold War era, again, I think, that order and how it survived in projecting stability into the post-communist space has also been quite remarkable, because that you needed that stability. Otherwise, if things unravel, it could have created a much darker picture, I suppose. but, there are, of course, shortcomings. And when we look at it from a more critical eye, I think for all the good that it's done, the liberal order has become tarnished through the practices that were carried out by those who actually originally created it, from foreign interventions that have not exactly been good, and selective implementation of norms. For example, norms such as, you did mention the United Nations, Damon, as being, such a sort of embodied part of this whole structure, but also robust international institutions like we've never seen before. We take them for granted. We say they don't work and so forth. But when you look at the period before 1945, of course, there were no such international institutions that worked for us. So regardless of how much we're critical of them, those international institutions are there and they're important. However, the international institutions are also very important in the way they create aspirations and expectations and labels such as, I wouldn't say labels, but phrases such as responsibility to protect, or, for example, leave no one behind. But when, the transatlantic core of this liberal order, that's Europe and America, are not capable of implementing those very noble ideas everywhere, but only maybe in some places and in a limited fashion at the best, then I think the issue of expectations becomes quite problematic. And I think this has been one of the shortcomings. And the other shortcoming, I think, is a word that I use, which is not a real word, but, it's just, I made it up. It's called oughtness. You can even find an oughtness in Kennan when he says the Soviet Union, ought to conduct itself as such as a government among governments. And then in the 1990s, with this big blueprint of interlocking international institutions, there's a great sense of oughtness that this is what the world ought to look like. But when you mix oughtness with the application of hard power, I think it becomes a bit dangerous, because then you get military interventions to unseat regimes that are deemed to be non-compliant with the values or norms that are defined and dictated by a few. This is what I mean. Like when it starts turning into this club, to paraphrase Eikenberry, then there are certain problems. And this is really embedded way back into the Cold War era, where we had a lot written about core-periphery relations. I don't think we have a core periphery anymore in this system, but I think the assumptions behind that are still very much there. And that's when in the liberal world order ceases to be liberal. It becomes a system of imposed norms. And that goes against the very thing that you're trying to build. So I think we need to scratch back and look at the fundamentals. What would people like George Kennan, or you mentioned Dean Acheson, one of the founders of the Atlantic Council, what would they have thought of the way the liberal order has sort of unraveled as it is today? Because I think there's a lot that's in it today that they would not agree with, because it's not the vision of 1945. But like I said, 45 was a different world. You had a clean slate to build things on, whereas now there are challenges coming outside this rather cozy, comfortable transatlantic core. But I think we need to scratch back this and look at where we are now with that.
Wonderful, thanks very much. So it sounds like there is quite a bit of agreement on what the order is or was, and what some of the benefits have been, but maybe a disagreement on this issue of how have the leaders of the system executed. So Damon, would be interested in your views on that. And this is also probably a good place to transition to the second kind of part of the discussion, which are challenges to the order. So Professor Ibet mentions selective enforcement as a challenge, but there are other challenges as well: the rise of China, new technology, of course, the pandemic that we're all facing. So Damon, what about this question of selective enforcement, and what do you see as some of the other challenges to the system?
Well, look, I think we recognize that very much we're foolish to just hold on to the past and think that a romanticized version of a liberal international order, because there were a lot of drawbacks, even at its apogee of success. I mean, think about the struggle for civil rights in the United States in the midst of a struggle in the Cold War, something that we have echoes of today. So I think we have to recognize its imperfections have been a reality throughout, but we also need to understand and accept that we're going through a profound global change right now, and that a linear path forward from the past is not going to get us to where we want to go. And so I think we've got a huge challenge that begins with us at home first. First, as an American, with some humility, with an issue of renewal and self-renewal in the United States. Second, with our best friends and allies, where we see populist backlashes and challenges across the traditional democratic West. And then third, the real onslaught of challenge that comes from external forces, namely a rising China that looks to displace this, a revanchist Russia, which looks to challenge this, regimes like North Korea and Iran, which look to break rules and create new norms, as well as the reality of changes in technology and accountability, transparency, illicit finance, things that are really fundamentally changing the nature of the world today. And so we need to own our shortcomings. And I think you see that happening in the United States. I mean, just step back and think about, again, from the perspective of Americans who have been at the heart of this. And the average American looks and thinks over the past 15 years, we've been through a great recession where Main Street took a bigger hit than Wall Street. We've been paralyzed by a degree of sharpening political polarization and some degree of political dysfunction in Washington. And wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which Professor Ibet alluded to, which have not been popular here and have left a sense of ongoing, these endless commitments, if you will. And we are in the midst of a populist backlash in the United States and much of the West. And then on top of that, you overlay a global pandemic, the biggest economic crisis since the recession, and an extraordinary racial justice, anti-racist movement that's opening in the United States. And you can look at this and throw your hands up and say, what are you talking about? But to be honest, this is why, one, I recognize the reality that we don't just defend the past and continue the old liberal international order. That world is gone. It is evolving, is moving, and we better adapt. But at the same time, it's what gives me a sense of optimism that it is the nature of democracies that we're messy, that our people have a voice, they have a say, that we fight these things out, that we call ourselves out for our own shortcomings, that we have built-in processes of self-correction. And my goodness, our society is going through this right now. And so it's messy, it's painful, it causes our allies to be concerned, our adversaries perhaps to be smug. But it's actually the kind of churn that forces Americans to deal with where we are falling short of our aspirations, to tackle them head on, and recognizing that our ability to play a role in the world, to lead globally, to help inspire, to help have the financial, economic, and political weight, it requires us having our house in order at home. And so we're in the midst of a bit of a mess here. And yet I think this is the seed, the kind of tumultuous nature we need at home to push ourselves. We need competition, if you will, to feel the heat and pressure from a rising China, to think about how we straighten our house, renew ourselves at home, and develop a new model of catalytic American leadership that has perhaps a bit of more of a dose of humility, recognizing the nature of the world we're in, but doesn't just step back and say, we're out, over to you, and leave a vacuum. If that's where we were to land, it would be devastating for not only American interests and our values, but for those of our friends and allies. And I think this is the messy process that we're in the middle of.
Great. Thanks, Damon. And you mentioned the need to adapt going forward, and I do want to get to that next. Where do we go from here? But just pausing on the challenges a little bit. Professor, I bet you mentioned what you saw as the challenge of selective enforcement. What about some of these other challenges that Damon pointed to, the rise of China? How is that viewed in Turkey and the United States? It's seen as the foremost threat to U.S. national security and economic well-being. What about the pandemic? And what do the state of U.S.-Turkey relations today tell us about the order? Of course, both are early members of NATO, which has been a core of this order, but we are facing more challenging times. So over to you on the challenges facing this system.
But lots of other things, I think, not just challenges, because you sort of bundled a lot of things there in your question, which is really good. I'm really pleased that Damon was so optimistic about these very deep challenges that the United States is facing right now, which we're all watching. And I think, I speak also for everyone in Turkey that nobody in NATO would really like to see the United States stepping back. But I think, what we need to do is reevaluate, I think, the transatlantic relationship, what it means to be allies, how we cooperate in a different world with different parameters, how do we align our maybe different priorities in security challenges. Obviously, for a country like the United States, it's going to be much more in terms of great power rivalry, whereas the implications of great power rivalry will obviously have an impact on a regional country like Turkey. But because it's not one of the great powers, it's not going to look at it quite in the same way as the United States does. So all of these, we have to understand our differences, where we are in the international system. I think we haven't really opened up that box since the end of the Cold War, because throughout the Cold War, we obviously had one threat to deal with, which was the Soviet Union. It was a very static situation. So our security priorities were the same. There wasn't a differentiation. And since the end of the Cold War, I think we've all been caught up in the euphoria of, yes, we won, hasn't it been fantastic? But we didn't really sit back and think about where we go from here, because let's face it, there's never been a dull moment. There've been these big interventions, Iraq, Iran, and we've all been kept a little bit busy with that. But it's only now, especially with Corona, that we can actually sit back and say, wow, something's happening to the world, and are we equipped to deal with this first? And can we use the same old channels of cooperation to do this? But just coming to the challenges of the liberal order, I mean, there are two main things: great power rivalry that Damon mentioned, and transnational threats such as the virus, the pandemic that we now have, climate change, financial crisis. So two sets of challenges, and these are sort of broadly defined as power rivalry and transnational threats. But aren't they interlinked? I mean, could you say that maybe the coronavirus has impacted or exacerbated the US-China rivalry to some extent? So they feed on one another, they bounce off each other. But there's also another set of challenges, which I think, Damon, you mentioned all the problems in the US right now, but I think it's actually the challenges that the other set of challenges are coming from within that transatlantic core, not outside it. And the main thing is this new clash between those within that transatlantic core that would like to preserve the erstwhile old liberal order, and those who maybe a new kind of mercantilism that sort of is a reaction to the liberal order. But this conflict, if you like, it's an ideational conflict. You can't see it anywhere else. It's not happening in the Middle East or Africa. It's happening, in America. It's happening in Europe. And it's very interesting, I think, for Turkey to watch that it's happening in the core. And you mentioned, where does Turkey fit into all of this? I mean, if you look back a bit, I think, I don't mean to, excuse me, say this in a shocking way, but I don't really think that Turkey has ever really been part of these three eras of the liberal international order that I mentioned. It wasn't present at the creation, to paraphrase Dean Acheson. But it was it was a member of NATO, it's an aspiring member of the EU, but its relationship with the transatlantic core was more of a functional ally, not a strategic partner in the beginning and throughout the Cold War. It was part of the liberal order by default. It was a functional ally because belonging to the liberal order was due to two unique attributes. One, having an interesting geostrategic location in the world, and the second is having the second largest army in NATO. But it did have a sense of belonging, I suppose, to the Western-led liberal order, but it was securitized. See what I mean? That belonging was securitized. Whereas in the last 2 decades, Turkey, with a fast-growing economy, being a trading state, is much more immersed in the practices of a global liberal order than it was before during the Cold War, because its position within the liberal order is not solely defined in terms of it being a functional ally and in terms of being defined as purely as in terms of security. But as I mentioned, there are different security priorities between allies, and this is not just unique to Turkey. I think this is the main challenge for NATO, that we all, most of us, have differing priorities. I mean, I noticed this a couple of years back. I was at the strategic conference for partners organized by NATO. And we were sitting there with a lot of partner generals and admirals. And, you know, I was asked to give a presentation about the Asia Pacific by a team of analysts, of course, who were predominantly from the US. And how much that was important to the United States. You could also see how little it mattered to, for example, a partner from the Middle East, who was much more worried about what was happening in his backyard in Syria, or a partner from Eastern Europe, who felt a much more resurgent threat from Russia, or a partner, say, from Northern Europe, who was more interested in, you know, defense cuts and defense spending. So they all, you put them all in the room, military men with different, very different security priorities. So I think this is one of the, you know, things that we need to look at. So it's not just Turkey having, you know, it's got a huge border with Syria. It's under a terror threat, and Turkey feels that it hasn't exactly been understood by its allies in terms of prioritizing its national security as it should in these past few years. And I think we really need to look at that very carefully. I think today's Turkey is more in the caliber of what you would call a strategic partner than the Turkey of yesteryear. But sometimes we'd like to, especially when you're looking at Turkey from the prism of Western analysis from Europe or America, you tend to look at it from a more identity construction. Whereas that Turkey of yesteryear that was defined in the alliance and also in the liberal order in terms of its functional attributes, in terms of security, was deemed to be somehow closer to the West. And somehow today's Turkey isn't. And I think this is an absolute fallacy. It's just not true. And I think today's Turkey is much more embedded in the liberal order because it is a trading state. And it's look at all its bilateral relations. The number one priority is to increase the trade volume with every single country it has a bilateral relationship with. So I think, you know, in that sense, we need to also, when I say we, I'm now putting my transatlantic hat on, to step back a bit from some of the labels that we've become too accustomed with, too comfortable with, such as, you know, is this a state that's straying from the fold? Is it still Western? Has it got Western values? We need to think a little bit differently. Of course, values are important, but we also need to look at, you know, in the grander picture of things. Is this a relationship that can actually have more benefit for a liberal international order? And I think it does. I'll stop there because I'm going to go on, I know, if I keep talking.
That was fantastic. Thank you. And just remind the audience that we'll be coming to you in just a moment for questions. So be thinking about your questions. I see that several of you have already asked questions in the Q&A function. I would ask, please identify yourself, name and affiliation, and that way I can recognize you when I ask the question. So Damon, back to you. This is an event hosted by the Turkish Heritage Organization and the Atlantic Council in Turkey. Where do you see U.S.-Turkey relations today, and what does that mean about where we are with this liberal order? And question to squeeze in, if I could, where do we go from here? And dealing with a former White House official, with you, a current advisor to a president, so it makes sense that you were both already looking ahead to where we go from here. But could I ask you to say a little bit more? Do we cling to this old system? Do we throw it out because it's not working? Do we revitalize it and adapt it? So 2 questions, U.S.-Turkey, and then where do we go from here?
Two gigantic questions, Matt. But first, let me disagree a little bit with Professor Ibed, in that I think I understand the point of your argument. But I would argue that in some respects, Turkey was at the heart of and a beneficiary of the liberal international order, precisely because if you think back about what those years, those decades would have been like if Turkey had not been part of NATO and had not been part of the West, along with its neighbor Greece, imagine what the Cold War would have looked like. Imagine the potential conflicts that could have played out repeatedly in Southeast Europe. Imagine the both economic and potentially military destruction that could have really perpetuated itself in Southeast Europe with Turkey at the heart. And so I think in many respects, this order provided a framework, an insurance, a protection to enable Turkey and Turks to develop, to evolve, and to be able to join more, as you've argued, the international economy, become part of, over time, move of globalization. I think my concern is today is that there are real gaps opening. And I'm really concerned about the state of the West, the state of the NATO alliance, and the state of the U.S.-Turkish relationship. I'm not naive, and I think, again, with a little bit of historic perspective, I served at NATO during the Iraq War. I saw the enormous divisions between the alliance at that time. I'm enough a student of diplomatic history to have understood the schism during the Suez Crisis, when the United States didn't back France and the United Kingdom. The differences we saw over Vietnam, over the deployment of intermediate range nuclear weapons. There's a fallacy to think about all harmony within the family through this period. On the other hand, I think today we really do have some challenges. And I think we've lost a sense of perspective where we, granted, have always had a sense of different interests. But I'm worried that our interests and our values are beginning to fray a little bit. And a go-it-alone approach, whether it's Turkish criticism of the United States and self-selection or going it alone, or criticism of Turkey going it alone, that we have a tendency to open the door to our adversaries to a system in which might makes right. And by some of those practices that undermine these norms and principles of respect of our neighbors, particularly our allies, provide the kind of cover that could give us real challenge, given what Russia is doing to its neighbors, what China is doing in the South China Sea. And so I think we don't quite recognize the nature of the struggle that we're going into. And Matt, this connects it to your next question. There is a compelling need for us to adapt, revitalize this system, and to understand that the great struggle we're going into, it will be the struggle of our time, is the rise of authoritarian kleptocratic powers led by China, but also including Russia and others. and how they really challenge the premise of a free world of free nations, free people, where people have individual dignity, of open markets. And I think that that's at risk. And so I'm concerned, and I've been critical of some US rhetoric and policies that point to divisions with some of our allies, while papering over some of the divisions with those adversaries, because I think we lose sight that the great struggle we're moving into is one of great power, confrontation, competition between autocracies and democracies, something you have been articulate on, Matt. I think that division and struggle between our autocracies and democracies is going to be fundamental for the coming generations. And we need to understand that we're in the same camp, on the same team, in the same family, and that there's so much at stake for our people. And that as we prepare for this great struggle, we need to do that with as many partner and allies by our side. And that's where we're not quite in the right place today. Some of our own actions, I think, are undermining that more important strategic framework.
Great. Thanks, Damon. So a call for US and Turkey and other partners to work together given new challenges. Professor Ibet, any response to what Mr. Wilson just said? And then more broadly, where should we go from here? And what does the future of this liberal international order look like? What should it look like? And then after this, we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience.
No, I'm not entirely in disagreement with Damon. Actually, I totally agree with them that Turkey belonging to this Western security community, if you want to call it by another name, has been incredibly beneficial. I wouldn't dispute that. I don't think anybody in Turkey would. What I was trying to say there was that throughout the Cold War, Turkey was sort of looked upon more, I think, again, I'm putting on my transatlantic hat on now, as a sort of functional ally, because it wasn't really a shaper. We talk about, this transatlantic core that is actually the shaper of these grand designs, these blueprints, and defining these norms and shaping these norms and norm dissemination into new societies that then get absorbed into these international institutions. So I don't think Turkey was quite there, but it's much more, I think, of a strategic partner now because of its situation as a country that is much more engaging and much more sort of a trader state in the liberal order than it was before. But ironically, it's actually under more criticism now for its belonging to the West, and I just wanted to draw attention to that irony. But when we look at the kind of state that Turkey's become now, I think we're going to see this almost like a model for more of this kind of state emerging after coronavirus. We see a state that's becoming more self-sufficient. Self-sufficient in the sense that maybe it's not taking a subordination to globalist institutions which dominate international political and economic relations through conditionality. But at the same time, it has much more robust relations all around the globe, and it trades globally. So it works within these rules, but it doesn't want to be dictated to. It doesn't want to be entirely reliant on given supply chains. It wants to be much more independent and self-sufficient in that respect. And I think Corona, in that sense, is forcing countries to review where they stand in terms of the global liberal order with regards to supply chains, with being more self-sufficient, but at the same time cooperating more. So it doesn't sort of cancel increased or more intensive international cooperation. In fact, it intensifies it, this current situation, but it's forcing states to really become more self-help states, which is what I think Turkey has become. Because I think Turkey, being a country that was a major player in the region, economically growing, emerging market, and so forth, had found itself already in a new role. But it was still being treated by its allies within its old functional role. To some extent, that was a bit frustrating. But on the other hand, there's also the whole practicalities of this. If you are turning into a state that is actually going to be more self-sufficient in everything that you do, then you also want to look at how the benefits, we talked about all these benefits that belonging to this club had for Turkey. In some instances, there have been moments, unfortunately, when it hasn't been that beneficial, where international institutions have been a hindrance, for example, or they haven't been there for countries like Turkey that are facing immediate national security concerns, such as terrorism on their doorstep. And they've had to turn to self-help to look after their interests, again with the Eastern Mediterranean, pushing Turkey into an almost exclusion, status, which has a country that has the largest coastline. And then Turkey had to start looking around and take matters into their own hands. So I think it's not just Turkey, more countries are regionally in their own backyard going to be more self-help and more self-sufficient. This doesn't mean that they want to break away from their traditional alliances. And if anything, they want their traditional alliances to be there for them and to support them in this new venture that they're becoming a different kind of country than they were before. And they want their allies to understand that and be more supportive in that. And be more supportive in their regional roles and changing security priorities. It's, no country wakes up in the morning and says, oh, I want to change my national security priorities today. You do that because you suddenly become faced with a threat on your doorstep. And you have to react to that because your number one priority is to protect your population. So, I think this is where, the transatlantic core, to some extent, need to sort of come down from their big lofty chairs of big grand designs and ideas and try to understand a much more tactical world rather than a strategic world. We're not in the 90s anymore where we can do lovely grand designs based on ideas. We really need to muddle through this together. And, for a while, I think what coronavirus is going to push lots of countries to do is to have more needs-based, short-term, transactional relations that with all kinds of countries around the world. Look at the vaccination, for example. You might, there's a rush to produce one, right? So look at how that's changing international patterns of cooperation. You might get a group of scientists in one country, any country, that might suddenly make a deal with a pharmaceutical company on the other side of the world. And maybe they might be joined by a group of scientists from another country yet, and they might come together. And to me, that is so much like the sort of modes of cooperation that Mitrani was talking about. When we talk about functionalism, which is essentially Mitrani's theory, it was the basis of what created the European Union. That states come together around a narrow technical need, and they just focus on that, and they cooperate. And out of that, you get cooperation in bigger things, in higher politics, and eventually you might even get a society of states like Karl Deutsch envisaged based on norms, but it's a bottom-up process. And I think where the liberal order went wrong since the 1990s was that the process has been very top-down. These are the norms, these are good norms, take them or else. And rather than that, we need to let the norms now, the same norms, I think they're good norms. I don't think there's an alternative to them, but we need to let them grow bottom up. And we can do that through what coronavirus is forcing us to do, which is having these web of transactions throughout the world that are needs-based. And eventually letting those webs form their own society. And here, I think the transatlantic core, including Turkey in that core as well, because it's a member of NATO, here we can shape that process. And I think this is how we need to think. I'm sort of, I shouldn't say this is how we need to think, because then I'm sort of going against my own thesis of we shouldn't do oddness. Just way but
No.
I'm just trying to say that we should just let it happen naturally, but we can also sort of gently nudge it forward.
Matt, Professor Corona, can I just jump in real quick on that? And I know you want to ask a question.
Please, Damon, go ahead.
But I just want to underscore that the beauty of the system that we are leaving behind, and yet we need to figure out a way to recreate, I would argue, is that it took our self-interest and defined that our self-interest was going to be advancing as peace and prosperity spread and advanced. That was the brilliance of this system. It was good for us that as we fostered peace, as other people got wealthy, we got wealthy together. So my fear is that what we're talking about, the world that you're describing, Professor, that we could be rolling into, if we go exclusively to sovereignty, our own interests, which I understand, you first and foremost have to take care of your own interests. But if it's all about self-help and tactical decisions, and it leads to misalignments between free societies, between the United States, between Europe, between Turkey, I mean, we're going to have more Ukraines, more Syrias, more Libyas, and this is going to open the door to our adversaries who do not share a view that the spread of peace and prosperity is good for all of us. And I think that's the danger that I am really concerned about, that we're losing sight. I accept the fact that we can't defend the past only. We've got to create a new future. But I think there's a slippery slope that we could go into, which might makes right, in which self-help, self-interests only, and a sense of sovereignty can really undermine our long-term interests of our people in a sense of peace and prosperity. It was the brilliance of our system that married our interests to those values. And I think it's up to us to figure out how to adapt and modernize that for the future. Sorry, Matt.
I don't think we're.
No problem. Thanks, Damon.
I don't think we're leaving the system behind. I don't think it's such a dismally sort of depressive world. I mean, we're talking here, I'm sure, about how to sort of readjust it so that it sort of works to the benefit of everyone again. And you actually just stepped on it. You pointed your finger on exactly what I was trying to say, Damon. That you said it was good for all of us. We need to get back to that now, because I think there's a lot of people in who belong to this whole sort of club, or whatever you want to call it, transatlantic core, EU, NATO, the whole thing, that they feel that it's not beneficial to their interest as much as it used to be. And I think that needs to be addressed, because at the bottom of all this, it's not just about values. You can never sideline interests and sovereignty. They have to be aligned. And when the interests and sovereignty are aligned with values, that's fine. But if there's just values imposed by a core that in some cases go against the interests of a sovereign country, then you're going to have problems. You're going to have reactions to it. And I think these are the nuances that we need to address. And I think I was just pointing a way forward to maybe, there are other ways of doing this, but that mine was just a suggestion that, rather than this top down, we need to look at bottom up processes of cooperation and norm diffusion.
Okay, wonderful. We're just about out of time, and I did promise that we would go to questions. So let me bundle a couple of questions. First for Damon, and then Damon, you can also use this as an opportunity to make any final remarks, and we'll ask you to try to be brief given where we are in time. And then same thing for you, Professor. I bet I'll group a couple of questions, also an opportunity for final remarks, and then we'll wrap up. So Damon, we have a question here about climate change from Elliot Roseman at the U.S. Energy Association. Is this an area where maybe the United States and Turkey, one of these kind of narrow tactical areas where they can cooperate, that would bubble up? And a second question from Kalyan Elliott at the Turkish Heritage Organization. What might it look like for the United States to take a more prominent role in promoting a liberal world order without displaying a, quote, might makes right, end quote, approach in a post-COVID world? So those two questions, and any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with. Damon, please.
Sure, thank you. I think the climate example is a good example of sort of universal and exclusive. I think that system is it was part and parcel of the past. I think it's going to be part and parcel of the future. There will be global issues that require global coordination. Look at this pandemic. Consider climate. This is an area where not just US, Turkey, but the United States, China, where you do need to be able to catalyze a sense of global action to address these things, which are in our common self-interest. And I think climate needs to be at the top of that. I think the United States has some room to go where it can restore its sense of leadership on this set of issues. And that will be an area of working not just with Europe and Turkey, but also with India and China very much on the need for some type of global solution. I think it lends itself to that. It's really important. It's also how we think about some technological norms and issues such as that. But at the same time, I think there are also, as we think about this adapted system for the future, there's an exclusive component that I would argue is that we as great democracies need to be able to preserve and coordinate action among ourselves, whether it is our economic growth, whether it is our security interests, whether it is how to protect our values and commitment to the individual dignity and human dignity of our citizens. And so this is where I think there can be new institutions and new opportunities. We have been advocates for something called the D10, but it's really just shorthand for recognizing that there's a role for a UN Security Council, but as long as Russia and China sit on the Security Council, we understand the constraints of that. There is a need for coordinating action among democracies across Asia, across Europe, across North America, across to bring in India, to bring in other countries in this type of conversation, because I think that's going to be fundamental to a new order in which we connect the concept of freedom at home to peace and prosperity globally and our interests there. And I want to see some creativity on that front. I am really hoping that Turkey will want to be that kind of partner, will want to be part of that camp, will want to be part of that conversation. And so I think it's really important that we spend a lot of time behind closed doors talking about the areas of disagreements today to try to figure out how to work through these. We are invested in a common strategy in which Turkey is part of the strategic West. And it means we've got to do some of the hard work of ensuring how Turkey and the United States are working cooperatively with our NATO allies, with our European Union friends, and that we're not in confrontation with each other. We need to understand the great challenges. How do we align for the struggle that we're going to be facing from a rising China and what it presents to the world? And we need to get on the same team, and we're not quite aligned on that at the moment.
Great. Thank you very much, Damon. Now, Professor Aybet, over to you for a couple of questions and any final remarks you would like to leave us with. First question is, given your bottom-up approach, what does that mean for some of the big strategic organizations like NATO? Is there still a future for NATO? And then two questions about Turkish military matters. One from Patrick Theros of the Gulf International Forum, who says that today Turkey is challenging the rules when it comes to the Law of Sea Convention, the Treaty of Lausanne, through the threat of military force against its neighbors. Is this part of the new liberal order? And then a question related from Ezel Sahinkia from Voice of America. How does the international system get reflected in places where Turkey is involved militarily, such as Syria and Libya? So several questions there related to Turkish defense policy, if you could address those, and then any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with.
Thank you. I think, when I talk about the liberal order and the need for a more bottom-up approach, I'm talking more about the previous set of questions that were directed to Damon, things like climate change and pandemics, all these transnational issues can actually be an opportunity for us to create new avenues of cooperation that can lead to the internalization and growth of these norms in a much better way, how we define them, what they mean to us, what they mean to our interests. So I was thinking that it would actually make the norms more robust when we do look at transnational cooperation bottom up. But that by no means means that we should leave behind important institutions like NATO. I think international institutions are here to stay. They've survived, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, the post-Cold War era. They're amazing in that sense. So why would you dismantle something that works so well? In terms of the question about the law of the sea, now Turkey, I must make this very, very clear, is not threatening or has ever threatened any of its neighbors, and Turkey's neighbors should not feel that they're under threat in any sense. Turkey's policy is one of regional cooperation, fair, just, but also one that results in win-win approaches. So, for example, I mean, we have reiterated this over and over again. Our foreign minister has said that over and over again with regards to energy, exploitation of energy sources in the Mediterranean. We do not wish to see the people of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus to be left out of this process. And I know the Cyprus issue is very long. We're not going to go into it here. Otherwise, we would have to have 3 more panels just on this. But the point is, we don't want anyone excluded out of this. And what we have done, we have also said that we are ready to negotiate with all countries and partners in the region for fair and equitable solutions. But when certain countries get together and they try to exclude Turkey, which has the largest coastline to the Mediterranean, and create their own zones or agreements by trying to confine Turkey into a very narrow space in the Mediterranean, then Turkey is obviously going to go out and look out for its own interests. As I said, when things don't work, then countries turn to self-help. But no country should feel threatened from this, because we're ready to negotiate with all the countries in the region as well. With regards to the last question, where does the international system stand with Turkey's specific interventions? Now, with Syria, as you know, Turkey has the largest border with Syria. And of course, it's been a huge security issue for us. First of all, with Daesh, we actually were a member of the international coalition of Daesh that cleared a larger area than any other member of that coalition single-handedly from Daesh in Syria. And then, of course, there's the PKK YPG terror, which we've also been suffering from. And of course, on that, we had different points of view, unfortunately, with our allies in the United States and with some of our allies in NATO. And this has been a very difficult and challenging time for alliance solidarity. And we're hoping that we can look to the future and find a way to put this behind us. And we will hope that our allies actually stand with Turkey in supporting it to meet its security challenges against this terrorist threat. Just to show you that, as an example, when Turkey did start the military operation into Syria, in all the different areas that it went in through these cross-border counter-terror operations, there were hundreds and hundreds of tunnels that were dug from Syria into Turkey. If these people had been minding their business in Syria, why were they digging tunnels into Turkey? And that's where they were launching operations. And as you know, there were so many terrorist attacks that led to the death of our armed services as well as civilians in the past few years, specifically, because of those attacks emanating from Syria. Our involvement in Libya is entirely to support the UN-recognized government. And we would like to see a solution as soon as possible within the Berlin framework. And we're involved in all the processes with regards to a political solution. But it's that, again, there are different problems there that need to be resolved.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we've had several other questions pop up, but unfortunately, I think we're out of time, a bit over time. So unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all the questions. Excuse me for going long, but it was a fascinating discussion. I certainly have several new insights. I think we've identified some areas of agreement and a couple of points of disagreement that could become grounds for future discussions. So I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it here. Thanks very much to the Atlantic Council in Turkey, and to the Turkish Heritage Organization for hosting this event. Professor Aybet, Damon Wilson, thank you very much for your insightful comments today. And thank you all for tuning in, and hope to see you at future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.